Some of it may actually even be true. Let's see. So, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the great seven wonders of the ancient world. We have a list here of them. This is the traditional list of the seven wonders of the ancient world. You've already heard from Dr. Silverman about the Great Pyramid at Giza. Today you'll hear about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And during the remainder of the series, you'll hear about three others. Two will admittedly be skipped. But are these the great wonders of the ancient world? No, they're the great wonders of the Hellenistic world. This list was clearly composed in the Hellenistic period, probably in the 3rd century BCE. The latest one of these, the one that was the most recent to us, is the Pharos at Alexandria, built sometime 300 to 60 BCE, or Dr. Wegner will give a closer date, I'm sure, when you hear from her in March. It's interesting that the earliest and the latest are both from ancient Egypt. We have one from Greece, one from the islands of Greece, two from Turkey, two from Egypt, and one way, way off here in the east at Babylon, the one that I will be talking about today. We have, in effect, a lighthouse, two tombs, one temple, two statues, and one garden structure, shall we say. Now, where does this list come from? There are certainly various listings of great wonders of the ancient world, and the number 7 is quite often mentioned. In these, 7 was sort of a popular or mystic number. And the earliest sort of list, or what we take to be the list, comes from a Greek writer from Sidon in Lebanon who wrote sometime in the 2nd century BCE. He states, "I have gazed on the walls of impregnable Babylon, along which chariots may race, and on the Zeus by the banks of the Alpheus River. I have seen the Hanging Gardens and the Colossus of Helios, the great man-made mountains of the lofty pyramids, and the gigantic tomb of Mausoleus. But when I saw the sacred house of Artemis, the towers to the clouds, the others were placed in the shade. For the sun himself has never looked upon its equal outside Olympus." The sacred house of Olympus, of course, being the temple of Artemis, or Greek Diana, at Ephesus. One notices who is skipped from this, the lighthouse of Alexandria. And what do we have in addition to make up 7? The walls of Babylon. The walls of Babylon appear in numerous places, and in fact, in the classical writers, Hellenistic writers, and cuneiform sources, what was a marvel at Babylon were the walls of that city. Herodotus tells us in his great history, Herodotus, the great historian of the 5th century BCE, describes Babylon and in great detail describes the walls of the city. It is surrounded by a deep moat full of water, and within the moat there is a wall 50 cubits wide and 200 high. The royal cubit is 2 inches longer than the ordinary cubit. On the top of the wall, they constructed along each edge a row of one-room buildings facing inward with enough space between for a four-horse chariot to turn. There are 100 gates in the circuit of the wall, all of bronze. The great wall that I have described is, so to speak, the breastplate or chief defense of the city, but there is a second one within it, not so thick, but hardly less strong. So we have actually many, many descriptions of the walls of Babylon. Now, how do we know about Babylon? Well, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated the site from 1899 to 1917, so for about 20 years. In fact, he basically lived on the site. He had a vast team of workers there helping him in the excavations of the city. In fact, he even built a railroad to help remove the dirt from the site. So he revealed a large part of the city and published these. In fact, he has a whole book on the city walls of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Now, last year I was on sabbatical in England, and one day I got an email from the people arranging this lecture series telling me that I had been volunteered to give this lecture by my dear colleague in the next office. Now, if he had suggested the Great Walls of Babylon, fine. There's a lot about them from cuneiform sources. There's a lot about them from classical sources. They've been excavated. I could have shown a large number of, I hate to say rather boring photos, but I could have shown you where the walls were, the length of them, and so on. And I could have talked about the history about it, how the city of Babylon was destroyed by the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib in 689, razed to the ground so that no one would ever find the site again, how it was rebuilt by Sennacherib's son 11 years later, and then under the Neo-Babylonian kings, it became a great wonder of the world. I could have talked about the sieges of Babylon, in which the Babylonians held off the Assyrians from the city, sieges in which people starved to death, stories about the people in Babylon eating leather because the food had run out, about selling their children into slavery to get food so that they could eat, or about how stories of a mother would not open the door to her daughter because they were all starving. So I could have done a really great thing about that. Unfortunately, I got volunteered to do the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And the problem with this, of course, is we don't know where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were. We don't know what they look like. Maybe we found them and we don't recognize we've found them. Were they a figment of the classical writer's imagination? We do not have any description of gardens at Babylon from the cuneiform sources, the area of which I'm a specialist. All the information on them comes from classical sources, Greek and Roman writers. Now, I'm a cuneiformist. I work in the Akkadian language, so this causes a little bit of a problem for me. So we'll see what happens in this lecture today. Now, Koldewey did a fabulous job of excavating at Babylon. We can see the great walls of the city, the area that was enclosed within the outer wall and the inner wall was something like 3 3/4 square miles. It was probably the largest city in the ancient world. We have excavations of various palaces throughout it, great ziggurats or stage temple towers, numerous temples around the city, gateways, processional roads, and of course, as I said, the walls and gates and moats and so on. So we actually do have a lot that has been found. Now, what do we think the city may have looked like in antiquity? And we're going to take a few minutes and watch a video clip from the courtesy of the Royal Ontario Museum doing a flyover of what Babylon may have looked like in the ancient time. Here we see the reconstruction of it. We're going through the processional way, entering the Ishtar Gateway, the main processional entry to the city. A replication of this is found in the museum in Berlin, with its glazed brick panels on either side. Going down along the side of the southern palace, we're going to turn inside. Okay, some bits are a little cheesy, but the glazed brick facade of the entry from the main courtyard into the throne room with the Lion of Babylon. Looking down over the palace as we leave to their hanging gardens of Babylon. Apparently the person who did this didn't want to do it, but he was forced into putting a hanging gardens in by the Royal Ontario Museum, or so I understand. Lovely nice pool on the top. Not that we want one on a day like today. Okay, heading outside down the great processional way. We're going to go into the enclosure of the Tower of Babel, the ziggurat of Babylon. Sort of a equivalent of a, looks like a multi-tier wedding cake, as I always describe it in classes, of 7 tiers with a small temple on the top, glazed in blue, looking out over the city. Seeing the major temple of Marduk down there, the Euphrates River, which runs through the center of the city. Now we're on the west bank of the river, looking across through a bridge. The Temple of Marduk, and looking down again from up on high, from the ziggurat, the Tower of Babel. So, that is what the people who organized this collection thought the city looked like. Now, we'll come back to some of that along the way. Now, as I said, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are not attested in any cuneiform source whatsoever. In fact, there are no real description of any gardens at Babylon in cuneiform sources. That's not really true. We have reference to orchards and so on within the city walls, but something special garden-wise for Babylon is not found in the cuneiform sources. So we're forced to rely on classical sources. And being a specialist in cuneiform in Egypt, I'm afraid I always think the classical sources, you got to read them a little bit with a little bit of doubt, a few grains of sand in taking them. So we have, sorry, my finger got too far ahead. Josephus, a Hellenic